thinking about all the time that I spent at the library when my kids were younger, especially, and all the programming and the things that we did. And I always think about libraries. My mom was a huge lover of libraries as well. She was an elementary school teacher. We spent much of our youth there too. Is just that the library is here really to help us to explore and to open our minds, and so many other things we do. And I think that's really what epitomizes Wit, Wisdom, and Wine, is the opportunity to hear from a number of speakers and to explore and to learn and to all of these exciting things. And it's why it's my great pleasure to introduce Mr. Tim Penny. Tim has been a regular presenter at Wisdom and Wine because he always has so much to share and so much insight. So Tim Penny represented Minnesota's 1st congressional district in the U.S. House of Representatives from 1982 to 1994. And while he was in Congress, he served on the Education and Labor, Agriculture, and Veterans Affairs Committee. And he also chaired the Subcommittee on Veterans Education and Training and the Foreign Agriculture and Hunger Subcommittee. Throughout his congressional career, Penny placed an emphasis on budget issues, and he chaired the Democratic Budget Group as well as the Pork Busters Coalition. Penny was named Southern Minnesota Initiative Foundation, or SMIFS, President CEO in April of 2007. SMIF's key interests include early childhood and entrepreneur development. Prior to joining SMIF, Penny was a senior counselor at Himmler Horner, a Twin Cities-based public affairs firm, and a senior fellow at the Humphrey Institute. Penny was also a member of the Minnesota State Senate from 1976 to 82, where he served as vice chair of the Transportation and Finance Committees. Penny has co-authored 3 books: Common Sense, 15 Biggest Lies in Politics, and Payment Due. Born and raised in a farm in southern Minnesota, Penny received his BA in Political Science from Winona State University. Please join me in welcoming Tim Penny.
Thank you, Catherine. It is a delight to be with you. I always look forward to this Wit, Wine, and Wisdom event, and I'm honored, flattered that you keep inviting me back to make a presentation. I don't think I've ever shared with this audience in the past my own affinity for libraries. When I first ran for the state Senate back in 1976, that is so many years ago now, there was a ballot question, a referendum on the ballot in Faribault County, my home area, about funding libraries. And my opponent refused to take a stand on that issue, and I proudly endorsed the initiative to fund libraries with a levy. And that initiative passed, and I got elected. So partnering with libraries and exhibiting my support for libraries goes all the way back to the start of my political career. And then, because reading is so fundamental, it really is, for every birthday and every Christmas, my children, who are now grown and have families of their own, and now my 8 grandchildren, get a book from me. And so it has become kind of a standing joke that at Christmas parties, as the kids are sitting around opening their presents, they will see the present for me that's obviously a book, and they will hold it up and say, I think I'll order it. I'll now open the book from Papa Tim. So it's just my way of trying to instill in my kids the importance of reading. So this year's topic, and I don't even know if you can see it because sometimes the screen doesn't show, I decided, even though I often do kind of reflections on the most recent election or other topical matters, I thought maybe this year, tying it back to books, I'd just revisit the second book I wrote with my friend Major Garrett, who is now the Washington correspondent for CBS News, and just reflect on some of the, I guess, some of the topics of that book. We wrote 15 chapters highlighting what we referred to as 15 big lies in politics. And then each chapter sort of expounded on why we would assert that that particular position or statement was a lie and what you really needed to know about that issue. A lot of people ask me over the years, why only 15? And I say the honest answer is because the publishing company didn't want the book to be longer than 250 pages. So this year I've titled the talk, The 15 Biggest Lies Revisited. The next slide up will show you the 5 that I'll talk about to some extent because there's just not enough time in a presentation that needs to be concluded within an hour's time to delve into all of the issues that I reflected on in that book. But the 15 that I've chosen to talk a little bit about tonight are money buys elections. My thesis then was that it wasn't universally true. In fact, in many instances, the candidates spending less did win. And I think largely that remains true today, but there are some changes today that I'll expound on. And among those changes are the degree to which independent or outside expenditures have now become such a significant factor in what is spent on campaigns today. Immigration hurts America. Never believed that and do not believe it now. But back when I was in Congress, and that's 20 some years ago, there were strong sentiments against immigration policy. We did pass an immigration bill during my time in Congress to make sense out of our immigration system. I'll delve into this issue because one thing has changed then as opposed to now, and that's the undocumented or illegal numbers are much higher today than they were back then. And I'm going to talk just a little bit about why it's unfortunate that we haven't updated and adopted any kind of immigration reform since 1986, the bill that I voted for, and it's long overdue. Education, my assertion then that it was a lie to say that more money equals better results, I think that largely holds true today, and I'll talk a little bit about some of the numbers that go into education funding and some of the results that we are not getting. These are not positive results in many respects, and so it does sort of bring into question whether more money is the only answer. Social Security is a sacred trust. Well, yes, in a sense it is. But it's really more of a political promise than it is a sacred trust, because the underlying Social Security law does not protect that program any more than any other program, and the budget is protected. So that was my assertion then, and that holds pretty much true today. And then back then, bear in mind, this book was written in 1998. So we asserted that it was a lie to say that the budget will be balanced by 2002. The interesting thing is that because of a very strong economy and some spending restraint, but not enough, we ended up with a surplus for 3 years, I believe, 99, 2000, and 2001. But by 2002, we were back in deficits. So that prediction or that assertion that the budget will be balanced by 2002 was a lie then. It was proven to be a lie in terms of the fact that we were in deficit spending in 2002. And sadly, things have only gotten worse in all the years since. So next slide up, I'll begin jumping into these 5 chapters and kind of bring it current. When I think about money buys elections, my own campaign and victory for Congress back in 1982 sort of disproved that money is the primary factor, because I was outspent by at least 2 to 1 in that campaign, and yet it went on to win. What I cited in the book, and it remains largely true today, is that the third bullet here, safe districts skew the numbers. There are frankly far too many safe districts in America where only one party is likely to ever win. And of course, the incumbents in those districts always raise a lot of money, and they have challengers that are woefully underfunded and weak challengers beyond that. So that does tend to skew the numbers and make it look like money wins the election. But in the competitive races, I wish there were more of these, but in the 50 or so races every year in a truly competitive district, there's more than enough money donated to the candidates on both sides of the aisle in order to finance their campaigns adequately. And so that again, speaks to the fact that money doesn't necessarily buy the election. And what we have learned over time is that outside factors tend to be more predictive of what the outcome will be. And that includes what's going on with the economy, overarching political moods. If there's a presidential race on the ballot, that tends to influence the Senate and the House races. Is there scandal involving one of the candidates, typically the incumbent? All of those factors tend to be a bigger influence on the election outcome than money alone. The next slide up. Just some charts. I got these charts from an organization called Campaign Finance Institute. And this just indicates essentially what I shared in my earlier comments. If you look across this, you'll see the challengers' spending amounts are in blue and the incumbents are in red. And yet these are challengers that won in those election cycles. And you can see that with the exception of 2018, challengers actually spent less and still were winning in many, many of these races across the country where an incumbent was defeated. So again, incumbents have a fundraising advantage, but their defeat is not always, and in fact, frequently is not protected by the amount of money they raise because challengers are able to raise enough, maybe not as much as the incumbent, but enough to win those races, just as I did back in 1982. The next slide up is also from the Campaign Finance Institute. This just indicates the cost of campaigns has risen dramatically over the years. When I ran for Congress in the 1980s and early 1990s, I don't believe I ever spent more than $250,000, which may be as much as $500,000 today. But as you can see, even in a House race, the average that you have to spend in order to compete for a US congressional seat is now in excess of $2 million. So campaign spending, even the spending that goes directly to the candidates, is much, much higher now than it was all those years ago. But again, spending more than your opponent is not the only thing that matters in terms of winning the election. The next slide up. This is the independent expenditures. And this has been exacerbated in recent years for a variety of reasons. And this includes money spent by the political party to help their candidates win, but also these outside groups that are euphemistically called independent groups, because in a real sense, they aren't independent. They are affiliated one way or another with each of the major parties, and they are there to raise basically money that is often not disclosed, and to spend that money to influence the election outcome on behalf of the candidates of their favored party. And you can see by these bar graphs that these outside expenditures are exceeding the expenditures that flow through the candidates themselves. And that's becoming an increasing problem in our election system, and one that we need to be aware of. And I'll get into why we need to be aware of and concerned about that a little more in the subsequent slides. So the next slide up. Independent expenditures and outside dollars. This just gives you a sense of how rapidly this has grown in just the last decade or so. The red bar is the amount that is spent, independent dollars that are spent through political organizations, the Republican and Democratic parties, the Republican and Democratic Senate and House campaign committees, and other party affiliated groups. And then the blue are the non-party organizations that have corporate interests, or they may have issue interests like the abortion issue or environmental issues on one side or the other. And so these outside organizations are increasingly funding most of the dollars that dominate our political airwaves in America, both outside money funneled through the political parties or their affiliated groups, or outside money funneled through organizations that are affiliated or aligned with one of the major political parties and their candidates. The next slide up is kind of my summary on this first topic. Does money buy elections? Maybe not, because I do believe that those outside factors, the economy, the mood of the electorate, scandal, whatever it might be, are typically more influential in terms of the outcome of an election than money alone. But this huge influx of outside money, independent expenditures over the years has become a real problem because it tends to poison our election process. The fact is that easily 90% of all of the so-called outside money or independent expenditure is spent on attack ads. Not positive ads promoting a candidate, but attack ads destroying or trying to destroy the other candidate. And it also, just a sidebar, it also tends to nationalize elections in that the elections are no longer about southern Minnesota or Minnesota itself, because these outside groups pouring money into our state have another agenda and another set of interests that may not align with our interests here in Minnesota, but by pumping in all of this negative money, they do influence the way we end up voting in these races. And I don't think that's a very healthy thing. So I'll just give you the example of my own old congressional district, now represented by Jim Hagedorn. That was a Freudian slip because back in 1982, I defeated Jim's dad, Tom Hagedorn, to go to Congress to begin with, and then you allowed me to stay there for 12 years representing this area. But in the last election cycle, 2020, Mr. Hagedorn raised and spent $2.3 million through his own campaign budget. But independent expenditures on his behalf totaled $4.2 million. His opponent, Dan Feehan, raised and spent $4.9 million through his own campaign budget, but outside or independent expenditures totaled $6 million on his behalf. And bear in mind that adds up to $10 million of outside money as against barely $7 million of candidate money. And the vast majority, 90% or more of that outside money were negative attack ads, which really kind of poisons our electoral environment. It really creates an aura of negativity and anger that I don't think really helps our process very well. And it makes it, I think, a little harder for us to come together after the election's over, because so much of it has been negative and attack style. So that sums up where I wanted to go with money buys elections, just by bringing it current to show how it has not historically been true that outspending your opponent wins the election for you. But nonetheless, this new influence of outside money is having an outsized influence on our election climate, our election mood. The next slide up gets to the second lie: immigration hurts America. I'll be recommending a book at the end of this presentation that I really hope you can find. It's probably in the library, but it's not a current book. It's just one that looks back at America's history around immigration and extols the virtue of immigration over the decades, but also the challenges some of the new members of our society have experienced as they've come to our shores. This book, The 15 Biggest Lies, was written in 1998. And at that time, and it's true to this day, we have roughly 1 million people coming to America under one of our legal entry processes. They come here under a visa, they come here with a green card, they come here to study, they come here under an HB1 visa that allows them to work here because of a specific skill they bring. About 1 million come here legally every year. And at that time, when we wrote this book, we had about 100,000 who were entering largely across our southern border, and they were mostly Mexicans. But we had a sense that because of the 1986 law, which I supported, And then after I left Congress, a subsequent law, the 1996 legislation, which focused on enforcement provisions to help implement that 1986 law. And because of the North American Free Trade Agreement, which I also supported in my last year in Congress, that this concern about folks coming across the border from Mexico was kind of resolving itself. And I think in the years after 1998, that did tend to be true for a number of years. It's also worth noting that, well, whether you refer to them as the Department of Homeland Security does as unauthorized immigrants, or whether you refer to them as many others do as undocumented immigrants, or whether you refer to them as illegal immigrants, it's synonymous. These all really refer to folks that don't come here through the legal process that's established under our immigration laws. And 80% of Americans in recent pollings are strongly supportive of legal immigration, but roughly the same number have concerns about illegal immigration. And that's where I want to go with the rest of my slides. The next slide up, please. Most of the slides are drawn on information from the Pew Research Company, which has done a lot of work on this issue. They research a lot of issues, but have done extensive work on immigration through the years. And they cited that in 2018, our immigration courts had 800,000 immigration cases pending based on the number of undocumented that were here, some of which include people who came here legally but then overstay their legal status, others who have come across largely our southern border and have scattered across the country to work here or there in our economy. But an 800,000 backlog in 2018 today is about a 1.6 million individual backlog in our courts, which means they can't get around to hearing the cases in a timely fashion. Back then, and until recently, for those who came here as undocumented or illegals, as choose your term, 85% were determined not to qualify under our refugee or asylum status or other status that would qualify them to be here. And up until recently, and this is beginning to change, a high percentage, as many as 80%, did not come back for a court hearing. So what we do know this year from the Department of Homeland Security is that there were 1 million crossings at our border this year. About an equal number were turned back under various provisions, including what's known as Title 42. But 1 million did come into the country and are here now. But that includes 400,000 that the Department of Homeland Security estimates came in without being apprehended in any way. So they estimate about 400,000 came into the country without encountering security at the border, but another 600,000 or so in the most recent year came here, were apprehended, weren't turned back, and were allowed to enter, awaiting a return to the courts for some kind of remediation of their claim of asylum or refugee status. So the next slide up is also from Pew, and this just shows you how the numbers have changed over time. And they've gone up and they've gone down. The last couple of years, because of COVID, this Title 42 has been one of the chief enforcement mechanisms used to turn most people away at the border. But that began to change this year, and I'll get into that in a moment. The second slide up, also from the Pew Research Institute, indicates the nature of where folks are coming from. We do know that in the last year, the folks that were encountered at the border many of whom were turned away, but a good number of whom were allowed to come in, and given a requirement that they return for a hearing at some point before an immigration court. 160 different countries were represented by those coming across the border. And that includes nations in Africa, Eastern Europe, the Middle East, but more recently, and that also includes Romania, Armenia from Eastern Europe. But the most sizable increase in numbers are from the countries that Pew has placed on this chart. You can see up until about a year ago, relatively small numbers coming from Ecuador, Brazil, Nicaragua, Venezuela, Haiti, and Cuba, and now notable increases across our southern border from those several countries. So the mix of immigrants coming through Mexico to our southern border has changed dramatically in the last year. It had been almost exclusively Northern Triangle countries, El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, until this last year, and now these numbers have increased dramatically. The next slide up does indicate of those that have come here, primarily family units are being allowed to stay, unaccompanied children are being allowed to stay. For the most part, single adults are still being turned back under that Title 42 requirement or policy. The next slide up just gives you a look at this year compared to the previous year and the level of increase in immigration across our border at these various checkpoints. And you can see those numbers are pretty sizable, 100, 200, 300% increases, even 500% increase at some of those checkpoints. And the next slide up indicates in the gold, largely those that have been turned back one way or another for one reason or another over the course of time. And then the blue that you can see in the last calendar year are the bars that represent the increasing numbers that have been allowed to enter with the expectation that they return to court at some point to mediate their status and determine whether they are here under an asylum or a refugee status that would allow them to remain here. So all of that is background, and I just wanted to run through the numbers because when compared to 23 years ago when Major and I wrote this book, we were looking at 100,000 largely Mexicans that were coming to America. And this past year, when you tally it up, it's about 1 million that have come into the country. And the next slide up, I just want to focus on this because it reinforces what we saw on the previous slide. How many were expelled in the previous year or several years, no, the year or two, pardon me for misspeaking, the previous year or two, and how many have been expelled this year. And you can see the dark blue adds up to that roughly 500,000-600,000 that have not been turned away, whereas in the previous years, a larger number of them probably would not have been allowed to enter. The next slide, I guess, gets to where I want to summarize. No, back up one slide. I want to summarize on this. So my main point here is that we didn't pass immigration reform since 1986, and we clearly need to make some sense out of this. And we clearly, if we had a backlog in 2018 of 800,000 cases in our immigration courts, and that's probably twice that number today, they'll never catch this up. So that alone is a piece of this that needs to be addressed with immigration reform. And then the the standards under which people would be allowed to stay or not need to be clarified and brought current. All of that needs to be addressed, and it is a tragedy that we spent like 30 years not doing anything more to update and bring current the immigration policy for our country. And both parties are to blame for this. During Trump's years, I believe that both infrastructure and immigration reform are issues he could have gotten bipartisan support on if the other party had been willing to work with him. And yet the Republicans are not blame-free, because there was a group of 7 senators back in 2010 that tried to produce a bipartisan immigration reform, which would have been signed into law by Obama, but Republicans in the House stopped it cold. And so both parties have been guilty in the last decade or so in stalling or stopping the immigration reform that I think the numbers that I've shared from the Pew Research Institute indicate is long overdue. Next up is money equals better results. And I decided to use kind of a comical poster here: more money, less worries, from Homer Simpson. And not less worries if the money isn't producing better results. And I think some of the numbers on the next slide bear out that we do spend a lot of money in our public school system. But you can see that in Rochester, Owatonna, St. Charles, and Broda, Stewartville, we're spending notably less per student than Minneapolis and St. Paul. And I think it's inarguable that the results that we're receiving or achieving in many schools around the state tend to be a lot better than the results we're getting in our center cities. Next slide up. And we all understand that there are additional and unique challenges faced in the metro area that we don't face in many other communities around the state in terms of low income and students of color. But the fact is, we do spend an awful lot more in those school districts and are not getting appreciable results for the money spent. In Minnesota, these are statewide numbers. The population in our public schools is 64% white, 36% Black, Indigenous, and people of color. Math proficiency is 52% statewide, but only 27% for people of color, students of color. Reading proficiency, 60% statewide, 37% for students of color. And the high school graduation rate is about 90% across the state, 73% for students of color. Next slide up. Disparities are the largest in the nation when you look at graduation rates for Blacks alone. The national graduation rate for Black students in the country is 80%. Here in Minnesota, it's only 70%. We also know, based on studies done by the Minnesota Federal Reserve Bank and other organizations, that reading by 3rd grade is critically important to success thereafter. If you're reading at grade level by 3rd grade, you do better thereafter. If you're not reading at grade level by 3rd grade, you're 4 times more likely to drop out of school. In Minneapolis, measured against 8th grade students, there's 57% proficiency in math. And in reading, measured against the cohort of 4th grade students, there's 56% proficiency in reading. But an organization called Racial Justice Network broke these numbers out, and they assert that overall, reading among white students is at a 74% proficient level, and among Black students at a 19% proficient level. And with math, 64% for the white students, only 9% for the Black students. And I raise all of these numbers because something's not working here. And I don't think it suffices to simply say, spend more money and we'll fix this, because we've been spending money in greater amounts to try to fix this for many years, and we still have these embarrassing numbers. Next slide up. So I don't have the entire solution here, and this is something you need to talk to your state legislators about and the governor about. But some things that I think will work better than doing the same thing and expecting different results is to put a much, much higher emphasis on early childhood. And I will say, and I was on a conference call with the governor just a couple of days ago, that with the surplus that is available, one of his top priorities is going to be to finally put some really significant new money behind early childhood. And I do applaud him for that. And I think there's bipartisan interest in that in both parties in the legislature. So let's hope for some action this session. But I'm on the board of directors and just got off a conference call with my fellow board members of a group called Close Gaps by 5. And we are all about advocating for quality early childhood. And we have advocated for the parent aware for school readiness rating system so that our early childhood providers are taking the training they need to provide really quality care so these kids come to kindergarten ready to learn. We also support scholarships for the lowest income students to get them into the highest quality early childhood settings. And here at the Southern Minnesota Foundation, which I've been proud to lead now for 14 years, we do dozens of early childhood provider trainings every year to help them get the continuing ed credits they need to stay in business and to be the best they can be with the children in their care. And so all of these investments in early childhood and more will pay dividends down the road because just as I cited that third grade reading and how reading at grade level at third grade improves your prospects for success thereafter. We also know that coming to kindergarten ready to learn improves your prospects for success thereafter. I'm also on the board of directors of a group called North Star Education Finance, and we've done $5 million worth of grants to the following organizations in the last several years: Cristo Rey, College Possible, the Page Foundation, and the Wallen Foundation. And so far, we have supported 923 high school students with scholarships to get them into college, but better yet, to get them into college with a mentor. And there's a high success rate for these students completing college in the 4-year time frame. And virtually all of these students are low income. Virtually all of them are students of color, and virtually all of them are first-generation college students. So there are proven solutions to some of the gaps and the deficiencies that I think exist in our approach to education today, and these are among them. And then last but not least, an emphasis on both post-secondary education to get those college credits while you're still in high school. Saves you money, and especially for low-income kids, that could make a huge difference. But then technical training. We need to do a better job of creating technical training opportunities while still in high school. And I know that Rochester has moved in this direction, and many other school districts are beginning to move in this direction. But technical training is something that got lost in our K through 12 system for too many years, and it's only recently coming back. So those are just kind of my own thoughts about what could work and how could the dollars we spend produce better results. Next slide up. Social Security is a sacred trust. Well, it's a political program just like any other program in our federal budget, but it does have a unique status in that it's so popular politically, it would be tough to get rid of it or make any changes in it. And that's why, sadly, there have been no reforms to Social Security since 1983. That was my first year in Congress. It was one of my first votes in Congress, was on a package to save the Social Security system, which was then in deficit. And so we gradually raised payroll taxes. We delayed cost of living increases. And we delayed, for my generation, the baby boomers, the retirement age from 65 to 67. The next slide will show you a couple of things. So note the day that annual Social Security payroll taxes were no longer sufficient to pay annual Social Security benefits. That was way back in 2008 or 2009. And then note the date that the surplus we built up from the late 1980s through about 2008 or 2009, note the date that that so-called trust fund will run out. That's 2032 or 2033. But also note this, none of that surplus, that trust fund, was actually saved. It was really used to pay for other government program with the promise that we would pay it back when needed. And we're now in the process of paying it back. But in 2032 or 2033, the trust fund will be exhausted, and we will then only have 70% of the annual payroll tax revenue that we need in order to pay the benefits that are due to be paid that year. So something has to change. And what I'm afraid of is when we get to that point, we'll just keep borrowing money to pay for the gap in the Social Security fund. Next slide up. And this is the problem. There were just far too many beneficiaries for recipients. Back in 1950, there were 16 people working for every beneficiary because the program was relatively new. By 1980, there were 3 people working for every retiree. Today, there are just under, in 2010, at the time this program went into deficit, so to speak, went into dipping into its trust fund, there were about 2.9 people working for everyone retired. And that's roughly the 2.9 to 3 people per worker is what you need to sustain a pay-as-you-go or payroll tax system. Today, we're heading for about, in the next decade or so, we're heading for about 2 workers for every retiree. So the system cannot support itself on that basis. And that poses a huge challenge going forward. We've got 10,000 baby boomers retiring every day. Next slide up. And this gets to why this concerns me, because if you look at these charts, you will see on the spending side how much is spent in our federal budget on Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid for adults. Many people on Medicaid, the vast majority of those dollars are spent on retirees and nursing home care. And then you see how much we're spending on children, all told, everything, including tax benefits that go to families with dependent children. So we really have a federal budget that is not investing in the future so much as it's investing in those of us that are already past our prime. That's kind of harsh to say, but that's just the reality of it. The next slide up. And here's what's happening with how much we spend on children. If you include everything, including the tax breaks that go to families with children, we're spending now not even $500 billion a year out of the federal budget to support children. And we're spending almost as much of that on interest on the debt. And interest on the debt doesn't buy us anything new. It just pays for the debt we've already incurred. And I'll get to this in a later segment, interest on the debt is surprisingly and unusually low right now because interest rates are so low. But if interest rates climb, these interest costs grow rapidly. And that's something we need to really be worried about. But just my point is, we're spending more on the past through interest payments than we are on the future through payments that support the youngest among us. Next up. The lie, the budget will be balanced by 2002. It was not. We had 3 years of surplus because of a very strong economy in the late 1990s, and they went away. And what did we do? Part of the reason they went away is because in 2001, we passed a these are all 10-year numbers, by the way. We passed a $1.8 trillion tax cut. And then we went to war in the Middle East. And over 10 years, that cost us $1.5 trillion. And then with the 2008 recession, we spent almost $900 billion on stimulus. I listed the Affordable Care Act because even though that was a $950 billion 10-year cost, they did offset that with about $800 billion in tax increases. But of course, that still left us over a 10-year period with $143 billion of deficit or deficit spending. And of course, that $800 billion that went for the new program was not money available to pay down the debt or reduce the deficit. The Trump tax cuts were another $1.8 trillion over a decade. And then the 5 COVID response bills last year totaled $5.3 trillion. So that's an awful lot of deficit spending. I thought things were bad when I left Congress, and I thought things were bad in 2002 when Congress didn't quite meet the goal of a balanced budget because they frittered away the balanced budget in a short period of time with tax cuts and war costs. Things are so much worse now with $28 trillion of debt and climbing. Next slide up. And this shows you how it's climbed over the years. When I left Congress, we had a $4.5 trillion national debt. When I wrote this book with Major Garrett, we had a $5.5 trillion national debt. It basically held steady at about that level in the late 1990s because we actually did have a balanced budget for a period of time. But now we're at 28 trillion, and most of that has been added in just the last several years. And this gets to that interest cost as well. Surprisingly, we're only spending between, I don't know, 350 and 400 billion today on interest costs, but as soon as interest rates start to climb, that interest cost will climb rather dramatically. So again, do we want to continue to spend so much of our federal budget on the past, or are we going to do more to invest in the future? And these numbers indicate that things aren't looking so good right now. Next slide up. Yeah, there's the interest costs going forward based on a current law and projections by the Congressional Budget Office. Not a very happy bar graph because none of these costs buy us anything new. It's just paying interest on our past or our accumulated debt. Next slide up. Political lies. I think I did this one other year when I gave a presentation, but this may not be the same audience, or at least certainly some of you are new. Is some that we're all universally familiar with. I will not send your boys into a foreign war. FDR made that promise during his 1940 re-election campaign, and a year later we were at war. I am not a crook, and Nixon said that during the Watergate scandal. It turns out that he was, because he covered up a lot of things he knew about that scandal and the misdeeds. I did not have sexual relations with that woman. That was Clinton's denial of any untoward behavior toward an intern that worked in his office. These are just lies that everyone in America is familiar with. The next slide up are more current lies, are these political lies. President Trump, in his campaign, I will build a wall and Mexico will pay for it. Then Democrats, for the next 2 years, Trump colluded with Russia to win the election. Then Trump after the election was stolen. And then President Biden, a year ago during the campaign, I will shut down this virus. Now, I'll say about the first and the last, the Mexico will pay for the wall, that's hyperbole. And I'll shut down the virus, that's hyperbole. Lots of candidates say things, overstate things because they're trying to make a point. And that's just politics, and that's nothing new. But the two in the middle are more concerning to me in terms of what it means for our faith in our system and our faith in our elections. Nothing after 2 years of investigation documented or demonstrated that Trump had done anything to cooperate, coordinate, let alone collude with Russia in terms of the 2016 election. And nothing has been documented or proven to indicate that anything about the 2020 election justifies the term that it was stolen. So both sides are a little bit guilty of undermining our faith in election by by pushing these narratives that call into question the integrity of our process. So next up, I just always try to end these presentations with some recommendations about books on the themes that I've covered that I would recommend to you. Money and Good Intentions Are Not Enough was written by the Dean of the Humphrey Institute during the years I worked there as a senior fellow. John Brandel was also a Minnesota State Senator from the Minneapolis area. And a lot in this book, including his chapter on education, will get to the point I made earlier about money doesn't necessarily equal better results. A Nation of Immigrants was actually written by John F. Kennedy many, many years ago. And it's a good snapshot of the history of immigration up until the 1960s, and a really good way of looking at the positives of being a nation of immigrants. The Luckiest Man by Mark Salter, he was a speechwriter for my friend John McCain, who passed away a couple of years ago. John McCain was a maverick in the Senate, and as such was very influential in getting things done, including being part of that group of 7 that attempted to pass immigration reform back in 2010. And it's a great look at the life and times of Senator McCain. And then Laughing at Myself, a book that just came out by a colleague of mine from the House of Representatives, former Congressman Dan Glickman of Kansas. I served with him on the Agriculture Committee. He went on to become Agricultural Secretary for President Clinton, and then was head of the Motion Picture Association for several years before he retired. And it's just a good look at his history on Capitol Hill and how he, like Senator McCain, really prided himself on keeping good relations and being able to work with both sides in respectful fashion. So both of those books, The Luckiest Man and Laughing at Myself, are uplifting. And I always try to give you something to make you feel a little better, because very often I feel my talks about what's going on in politics that tend to be a little gloomy. So with that, next slide up. Just pictures of these books so you can recognize them when you see them. They're probably in the library. Next slide up for the next 2 books. And with that, it brings me to the end of my presentation. I thank you for your patience, because I didn't leave a lot of time for questions today. But I had a lot of ground that I wanted to cover. And I think I proved why 5
Yeah, that was
5 was better than 15. We'd be here all night.
Then we've been here all night, but wow, that was fantastic, Tim. I mean, as you're talking through these, I was just thinking how problems oftentimes, I mean, they remain the same, they evolve, all of that, but it's so important that we still talk about them. Because if we don't talk about them and we don't bring light to them, there's no way that we can actually solve them in any way. We did have a couple of questions that can't come through. And one was, so my daughter-in-law is a teacher and she has 29 students in her 4th grade class. Many of them are on IEPs, plus we're during the pandemic. How can we reduce class size without putting more money in education?
Yeah, that's a really good question, because I do support smaller class sizes. I think that could be hugely beneficial. Individualized attention is a key to success. And that's one of the reasons the scholarships that the North Star Education Finance Group that I'm a part of is focused not only on helping fund their education, but fund a mentor to help them through that transition from high school to college and success in college. So I wasn't saying that we need to spend less on, I was just saying if we're going to spend more, it's how we spend it that matters. And so some of the examples I gave of where we could spend more and achieve better results are things that, it doesn't necessarily mean we're going to spend less per pupil in Minneapolis, St. Paul, but if we're going to spend more, maybe you don't put it on the per pupil thing. Maybe you put it into some other approach. And that could include a class size component as well.
Yeah.
I remember like 30, 40 years ago when I first went to the state Senate, Congressman Al Quie ran for governor and he got elected as governor. And one of his promises was to reduce class size. And for a period of years, we appropriated enough money to accomplish that. But I think we've drifted away from that in recent years.
Yeah, right. I know Audrey Betcher just put in there that every school needs to use data. And and that really does help decide where monies are best spent. And school budgets are a complex beast for sure, and what's designated and all of that. And then finally, another question was, is there any way to limit independent election spending or special interest group spending in elections?
It's a huge challenge, and I'm afraid it may require a constitutional amendment. Just to say that campaign spending is allowed only by individuals, and the contributions can only go to political candidates, so that we then hold the candidates accountable for how they spend the money.
Yeah.
Because one of the reasons we're into all of this outside or independent expenditure money flowing into politics today is because of a court ruling that said that the Constitution doesn't prohibit it.
Right.
So it may require that. And people need to understand just the poisonous and deleterious effect all of this outside money is having on our system. And it poisons our attitude toward politics. And I think when you win, having been subjected to that kind of nasty vitriol and attack style ads, it makes it harder for you to feel forgive and forget the other party or the other side and what they did to you in this campaign cycle. So it may require a constitutional amendment, and hopefully there's a group out there that might lead that effort. We haven't changed the Constitution very often over the years, and that's a good thing, but once in a while we need to look at that as a solution.
Yeah, great point. Thank you. Thank you so much, Tim. And thank you to all of you for joining us for our first session. Again, I'd like to thank our sponsors. We'll be thanking them again throughout our time together. I know somebody had asked if we were going to provide a book list, and we certainly will work with our speakers to continue to do that and to put that out as well. We have, and there Brenda said she's going to share this reading list, and we'll share it on Facebook as well. So look at the Rochester Public Library Foundation for that. And so with that, we're going to go ahead and end this session. We have about a half hour before our next session, which is at 5:30. And Kim Edson is going to be talking about all of the exciting things that the library has done in this past year. And of course, we invite you to donate to the foundation. Up on our screen are information and links on how to do that. And we will see you in about 29 minutes. Bye-bye, everyone.
Thanks all.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Tim.
Stay warm.
Tim, thank you.
Yep. Bye-bye.